A big part of the core missionary task to multiply disciples, leaders, and churches is to start with the best practice we've got as you're engaging a new area, and then do it until you need to make adjustments as you go along. In this episode, I want to share with you 5 things we've learned a year into doing just that here in the New York City metro area. Coming up. Hey guys, welcome back to the H3X Podcast. My name is Mark Gearing, and together with your host, Dave Miller, who's not joining today for this episode, we explore the head, the heart, and the hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. And so in this episode, I'm getting reflective. We're heading towards the end of the year and planning some new things for 2023. But before we do that, I want to take a look back. And I think that's a big part of doing this work that we're called to do in multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches, is not to just keep moving forward all the time, but actually to reflect and take some time to look at what we have done. And then through that, we can problem solve and actually find out what God's doing in the midst of that and make adjustments. That's really a key part of the work. And so in this episode, I want to share with you 5 things that we've learned and will be either continuing or adjusting as we move forward in the work here. And I think this is just a helpful thing to do and in general, but then also I think a helpful thing to just model and talk about on a podcast episode like this, because so many of you who are listening are in a particular context. Maybe you've been doing that for years, or maybe you're super new to that area. But either way, if you've been there for a long time, you can actually get so used to the context that you may need some of that outsider perspective or a reflective perspective to be able to say, hey, what have I gotten used to here that maybe I need to think differently about so that we can see things move forward? Or if you're new to an area and you're just getting started, the reflective piece can be really helpful for taking the best practice that you start with and saying, what does that look like in this context? And so that's what I'm going to do in this episode, is just unpack 5 things that we've been processing as we've been engaging here. And by we, I mean my wife and I were taking some time at the end of the year. And we've got those that we're teaming with that we'll do that with as well. But just we're doing that with our family. And then we're going to make some plans and goals together with what we hear the Lord saying as we start out in 2023. And actually, I'm planning an extended fast at the beginning of the year just to make sure that we are really dialing into what God is wanting to do. But I want to reflect back before we do that. So here's the 5 things that we've learned a year into New York City. So number 1, be sure that you're called to an overwhelming vision. Be sure that you're called. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I really am just a strong believer. We should have an overwhelming vision. Our vision should be so big, it should be God-sized, sometimes we talk about, that we can't accomplish it in our own strength. And so, first of all, that vision should be overwhelming. But then the first part is what I want to emphasize in this episode as I reflect back on this year. Be sure that you're called. And so this has been really hard for us to engage in New York, and there's several reasons for that. But in the reality of it all, this is not an overseas context where we are having to learn language and engage in a whole nother culture, which by itself just requires a massive learning curve. That said, New York City, all of the workers we've talked to, and then our experience as well, is that the city itself is really about crossing 2 different cultural lines or barriers. And so by that, I mean that really we've got to not only cross into what it means to live in the city. That by itself is a huge change of pace. If you've not lived in a global city or a mega city, there's a whole different way of life that it just takes getting used to. But then also there's just a whole different culture of the different kinds of people that we're engaging with day to day. Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, and then some American background people, but even those have got their own unique contextualized culture within New York. And so all of that, again, that is just to get back to that number 1 point of be sure that you're called. That's very challenging. And so what we've experienced a year into this is we've had to go back again and again to, are we called to do this? Are we called to be here? And I think before talking about some of the other practical things we've learned, I think it's really important to just talk about that again and again, that this work that we're called to do really is just that. It's a calling. And so when we read that in Acts 13, 1 and 2, set apart for me Paul, Barnabas, for this work that I've called them to, that's an important piece of it because they hit a lot of persecution, right, as they went out to do the work. Not only persecution, but they hit a lot of barriers and challenges. Things were not just smooth sailing the whole time. And so what did they do in that moment? They're going back to that's right, Lord, you've called me to this. In fact, when I look at that in Acts 9, where there's this just amazing encounter that Saul has on the road to Damascus, I think that is about him seeing the risen Jesus, and there's that aspect of him being a witness in that way, a unique apostolic witness. But a part of this too is just he's going to have to suffer for the name of Christ, and he's going to have to go through a lot of hardship and challenges, and he needs to know that he's for sure called. And so as I'm reflecting back on the last year, we've hit a lot of challenges interpersonally, relationally with one another, in terms of just trying to figure out how to navigate the city systems and how to do laundry, as practical as that, but just lots of things as we've lived here. And it's caused us to go back again and again to, are we called here? And there's been a lot of spiritual warfare, to be honest with you, with that. And so that's come in practical ways, but also just overtly spiritual warfare. A lot of crazy dreams that my wife Megan's had. I've actually had quite a bit of demonic warfare in dreams. And then our kids have never experienced that before. We moved here and they've had some regular crazy dreams. And as we've talked with other families, that's just, everybody's got that. And so in all of that, rather than focusing on all that, the point is, are we called to be here? And if we're called to be here, how do we use that to engage as we continue to be here? And so we've really gone back to prophetic words in scripture a lot. So by that, I mean, we've gone back to say, hey, God, how have you spoken to us clearly that we're called to be here through the word? And so Acts 19 is a big picture in Ephesus that I've gone back to again and again. God's spoken to me about being here. Acts 9, actually, in Paul's calling has been big in God speaking to us to be here. And then we've gotten multiple different people sharing prophetic words. And so if that's a new idea to you, or you're just kind of unfamiliar with that or uncomfortable with that, man, that's a big part of what we see in Scripture. And it's a big part of what fuels us to be able to press through, is knowing that we've heard from God personally in what we're called to do. So if you don't have that, get it. Reach out to people and begin to ask people to pray, and find people that you know that might be wired that way, and ask them if they might pray for you and see if God would speak. Because we need to know that we're called to work and to do what we're called to do, because the challenges are going to come, and we need to be able to go back to that and rest on that. So that's number one, be sure that you're called. Okay, so number two, context matters. And in saying that context matters, that's saying that there is a reality that as we begin to engage in the particular place or the people that God is calling us to, that is going to come with some unique dynamics that are going to factor into how we go about the work. So it's important to understand that there are actually best practices that have emerged as people have begun to do this stuff around the world that we can start with, whether that's engaging a particular people group, how people engage Muslims, for example, around the world. There are some best practices that have emerged. Let's start with those. But then as we begin to engage with those, for example, in diaspora in New York City, we're going to tweak those a little bit along the way. We want to put them into practice here in this context quite a bit, right? And then we're going to tweak them. And then if that still is not getting traction, we're going to try to launch those best practices maybe in an experimental zone, or something slightly different that somebody else has tried in an experimental zone in another part of the city, and continue on what we've been doing where we are and those that we're teaming with. And then if all else fails, we're going to innovate. And so that's this idea of there are some best ways to advance a strategy. We want to start with those. But the point is, context does matter. And so as we've been engaging here in New York, what we've learned is that event trainings, which we've used often to find those that are called as those generals or those apostolic leaders, they look differently in this place. We've tried event trainings in the way that we've done them in the past, and just tried to invite people to them and have them invite people that they know. And what we've found is it's just really hard in a city where travel is hard, where things are transitory, where people's work availability changes a lot. So getting commitment to a long kind of training is hard in an environment like this. And so what that means is, hey, we're going to still try that principle of using event trainings to find workers and those that we can team with, but how we do those is going to have to look a little bit different. So as we're approaching 2023, that's something that we're processing through. A multiple day event training just may have to look a little bit different here in New York. So we're still processing through how, but we do know that context is going to shape a little bit that best practice of using event trainings. So that's number one, around context matters. And then number two, maybe just the transitoriness and the rapid change in New York is going to shape how we do a rollout of training as we're working with disciples that we're filtering from those event trainings. So we're going to shorten it up and we're going to do things a little bit differently to see what people do with what they receive and actually be able to attract a few more people in this context where things change so fast and there's just a lot going on. So context matters, and it's going to shape things a little bit. And then, so that's in terms of just how we're engaging with tools cross-culturally, but then also as we're engaging even Great Commission believers and we're trying to figure out how do we mobilize and train them, that's shaping a little bit how we do that. So that's number 2. And then number 3, things that we've learned is that with-ness is a huge part of finding disciples to pour deeply into. With-ness. And so what do I mean by that? Well, if you haven't heard me talk about that before, you see in the Gospels, I love the book of Mark, especially Mark 1 through about 5. You see a lot of Jesus modeling how he's engaging peoples and places and actually how he begins to filter for and find his leaders. And then he appoints them in Mark 3:13, right? And so there's a lot of with-ness involved in this. He's actually with them in them engaging their own oikos as they go to Peter's mother-in-law's house and they pray for her and the whole town is at the door. That's actually Peter and Andrew, and James and John, probably that's their whole relational network that's gathered right there. And so Jesus goes with them into engaging their oikos. And so what we've learned here is that with-ness is always a part of the work, but as we're trying to find those leaders that are going to raise up others and they're going to be engaging new people in new places, it's absolutely critical that we slow down and we're actually with the people that come out of the trainings or as we're in the harvest and we're sharing the gospel and we're finding people. And then that actually becomes a filter. So if people are not willing to shake up their schedule and adjust their schedule to be with us here in New York, even as hard as it is to travel around and to go to peoples and places here, that's actually becoming a filter pretty fast for us for who we should focus on. And so we're doing the 4 fields is the model that we're using, or the call to engage new people, to share the gospel, make disciples, gather them as church, and raise up leaders. Those 5 parts, however you want to call it, we're doing those, and then we're doing those with these disciples that we're beginning to identify, and being with them is absolutely critical, both for modeling and then finding out who's really with us in the boat. And so with-ness has become an important filter for those that we're going to pour more deeply into. We're going to be doing a whole lot more of that into 2023. Okay, number 4 in things that we've learned is that virtual or doing things online is a valid strategy. And so the goal would be to go from virtual to in-person always. That's always going to be preferable, but virtual is a valid strategy. And so I tested this out earlier this year and was able to collaborate with a friend of mine who has really built some effective filters through Facebook ads to find Great Commission believers to train. And so we ran a campaign and we did a training and we found 100 people that were interested in getting trained. Well, we did the training online. We did it over several weeks and had a lot of people from New York and then also from some other places in the US. We wanted to kind of broaden the filter a little bit in order to have critical mass on that training, to make sure we had enough people that it felt like, hey, this is actually a real training. And then we did that training over those weeks, and we actually ended up with 2 disciples that showed up in person when we invited them to show up in person and begin to practice. And one of those guys I've been working with together with a friend of mine, Scott, just week after week, and he is really showing himself to be a high capacity, big vision leader that we can continue to collaborate with and help him to multiply disciples. So that virtual piece was effective at finding people, and then it was effective at moving it from online to offline. And so that's something we're going to try again in 2023 to learn from that reality that sometimes it's hard to get people together here in a place like this, but we can actually use virtual trainings. And then again, our goal was the living room. We want to get people into the living room, but the virtual can actually be helpful for filtering and finding them and then getting them started. And so we want to do more of that to be able to get to more offline starts. So virtual is going to be a part of our strategy in 2023. Finally, number 5 that I want to share with you today is that joy makes a hard context sustainable. So joy makes a hard context sustainable. And so the reality is it is hard to engage in making disciples anywhere. And I don't want to minimize the fact that whether you're in a place like New York where there's just a lot of noise, a lot of activity, stimulation is challenging, life is challenging here, or if maybe you're in Dhaka or you're in Mumbai in South Asia, or you're somewhere in East Asia or in Europe or Central Asia where things are just generally hard anyways, it's always hard, whether you're there or you're doing this in your primary context that you grew up in. Doesn't matter. Making disciples is challenging, and getting things started is challenging. That said, we feel like we've hit this extra gear of just challenging work here. And so one of the books of the letters of Paul that I've really been feeding on is 2 Corinthians. And 2 Corinthians was written by Paul to the church of Corinth, right? And it was written after he had seen this movement catalyzed in Asia that we read about in Acts 19, about 1 through 10. If you just check out Acts 19, 1 through 10, and you see there right at the end of that in verses 8 through 10, that it says that Paul, he went to this hall of Tyrannus and he's training these guys. And he does this such that all of the residents of Asia, which is over a couple million people, more than that probably, they heard the word of the Lord in 2 years. Now that is an amazing stat, an amazing vision cast to hear that, right? And so then we fast forward, we hear Paul writing about this time in the book of 2 Corinthians, and it's incredibly helpful because we can vision cast all day long that that's what we want to see. We want to see a massive movement, and we can believe with big faith that God could do that, and he could do it here, he could do it now, he could do it through me, right? That's important that we have that. But to understand for that person that God is forming, or that team, because it's not just a person, a team that God is forming that he wants to use, what did they have to go through to get to that place? Well, you read the book of 2 Corinthians and you catch a vision of this, that in order for God to do that, what he did in Ephesus, Paul and team, and he uses the word we a lot. So it wasn't just Paul, it was a team here. They went through incredible hardship. And in fact, the book begins to just describe how they were stretched beyond their capacity, beyond what they begin to lament of life itself. I mean, it's pretty extreme language that they hit this point where it's like, this is too hard. Like, I don't know if I can do this. And in the midst of all of that, God, it says in the first chapter of 2 Corinthians, he comforted them. He brought the comfort of God began to abound in that moment for them. And if you fast forward on to chapter 7, verse 4, this has been a verse, I've been reading the whole book, and there's a lot of parts of it that have been really helpful in learning how to be sustainable here in New York. He actually says here in chapter 7 that even as this challenge and they were just pressed began to increase on every side of them, their joy was increasing as well. And you know what I've realized over the course of this year, and I've actually realized this in talking with guys we've been teaming with, one of my friends here, Matt, he brought this up to me and it's been really helpful, is, I've learned how to press through and to be persistent and to engage and have endurance, even in a place like this. We've learned how to press on, but to do that with joy, that's a whole nother deal. And I've realized that we've actually learned how to gut it out and just keep pressing forward, but not doing it with the joy of the Lord. And what I see here from Paul is that it wasn't that they tried to avoid hardship, and it wasn't that hardship didn't come, because it did, and actually came in quite an intense way, such that they began to just say, man, I kind of wish I was just home with the Lord, and a lamenting of life itself. But they hit a point in that process where they could experience the joy of God. And I don't know that I could say that. And so that's been a part of this process for us over the last year, is realizing God has called us here, right? So that was number one. We are called to this overwhelming vision that's far beyond our capacity. And so we don't need to avoid that. We don't need to run from that. We actually lean into that because that actually postures us with a wig take mentality of what's it going to take, right? So that's actually a good thing, to come under an overwhelming vision and be overwhelmed. But in the midst of all of that, I don't want to just gut it out and just push through it. I actually want to do that with joy. And I want to have that joy of God be the fuel that empowers me to continue to be engaging here and to do it in a sustainable way. If we're going to be here long enough to see traction, we need to do that from a place of joy. And in fact, that's what we've met. We've met person after person who's either given up or they've moved away. They just couldn't continue here for whatever reason, or God called them away. I'm not minimizing that, but ultimately, if we're going to continue to engage in a context that's really challenging, which this has been, we need the joy of the Lord. And so that's really driving our focus in 2023, that we want to just increasingly be those that go low and go slow. We want to be those that go low before the Lord and just trusting Him and His power to show up and His joy to fill us and to sustain us. And then we want to go slow. We want to just trust that God is going to open the doors, trust that He's going to bring the right disciples. And that doesn't mean that we don't still continue to engage in an apostolic way and seek to start new things. But it does mean that we are just incredibly reliant on Him and more realizing just how much, in order to start this work and sustain this work, it is a work of the Holy Spirit, and that looks like joy. And so that's my big prayer right now, is that my heart, that our family would be full of God's joy and that we would be sustained by joy. So that's as we're ending this year, those are some things that we've been processing through that we want to take into account as we approach 2023. And so part of that process for us, I'll just share real briefly, as we're beginning to approach the new year, is we want to make sure to set aside some time in light of that experiencing the joy of the Lord that's sustainable, to give space for God to speak again. And so we want to make sure that we're joining God where He's at work, to use that idea from, I think that's a Henry Blackaby deal, that we're joining God where He's at work. But I mean, it's actually also John 5:19. That's that Jesus only did what He saw the Father doing. But in order to continue to keep our heart there in a city that's constantly trying to stir us up into striving, we've got to set aside time. So we're going to set aside some time at the beginning of the year. We haven't actually identified a specific amount of time, but we know we'll be fasting and praying at the beginning of 2023 to pray into what do you want us to do, Lord, and continue to put the overwhelming vision before Him and say, Lord, this is your vision. This is your deal. God, how are you leading us to change the context in the midst of this? And then who should we spend more time with? And how do we filter those disciples? Lord, what does the virtual piece look like in light of all of that? And then, Lord, would you fill us with your joy? We want to go forth in your joy. And actually, that's not even just an ask. I find that joy is actually the overflow of just being fully laid down and submitted to the Lord, where we're not trying to strive or make anything happen. We can just receive His joy. So those are some things we're processing through that we've learned from a year in New York City. It's been really humbling. It's a really hard context to live in. And nobody here really cares about, hey, our big vision that we're meeting. And that's an exaggeration. People care. We've been able to connect with like-minded believers, but man, it's just such a humbling place that will just grind you down if you don't have a way to plug into what God is saying and have others to run with in the midst of all that. So those are the things that we've learned. That's how we're approaching that into 2023. Would love to hear from you guys. What are you processing through as you're looking back at the year and looking forward to the year ahead? Leave us a comment or shoot us an email. We'd love to hear from you. And maybe we can talk about that more as we approach 2023, what we're learning and how we're tackling that in the new year. So bless you guys. See you next time.